Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. This collection features 6 short stories from the December 1921 issue of the Black Mask magazine. M Osborne was its editor, and the magazine sold for 20 cents. I've added timestamp for each story in the video description. Hope you enjoy this one. The Mystery of the One-Legged Man by J.B. Hawley. The Black Mask, December 1921. Newspaper readers will recall the series of brutal and seemingly senseless murders that occurred in England and were attributed to a criminal whom some clever writer dubbed Peg-Leg, because after each of his appearances he left conclusive evidence in the form of footprints that he was minus his right leg and wore in its place an old-fashioned wooden affair ending in a round steel ferrule. I have said that these murders were seemingly senseless affairs, and that must have been the opinion of everyone who considered that they were committed without any apparent motive. From none of his victims was anything stolen, and in the history of their lives there were no passages to denote the existence of an enemy who might kill in a spirit of revenge for a real or fancied grievance. The first of these horrible crimes occurred in York. The victim was a certain John Elder, manufacturer of buttons, a highly respectable citizen. On the night of his death, Elder had retired to his study to write some letters. As the evening was warm, he had opened the French window, and according to the testimony of his butler, who was the last of his household to see him alive, had dragged forward a small table and placed it just in the window's opening. He had seated himself beside this table and begun to write when the servant left the room. At about 11 o'clock, this same servant had heard a cry coming from the study. He had hurried to see if anything were wrong with his master, and had found him lying beside the table with a knife wound gaping in his chest. Outside the French window, the police had found unmistakable footprints of a one-legged man. These they followed across the lawn until they came to the road, where they became blurred and finally lost in the medley of other prints on this much-traveled thoroughfare. Of course, the detectives rounded up every one-legged man in York and questioned them closely, but all had unquestionable alibis, and as the police were unable to discover or invent a means of tracing the criminal, they eventually dropped the case. Peg-Leg's second victim was a little higher on the social scale. No lover of English sport will ever forget the name of Sir Roger Bascombe, nor will the many unfortunate souls whom he helped in their need be more backward in cherishing his memory. As in the case of John Elder, Bascombe was killed between the hours of 11 and midnight, and on the grounds of his estate in Sussex were found another series of footprints of a one-legged man. Because of his prominence, the police put forth their best efforts to run down his murderer. But these went as unrewarded as had those of their colleagues in York. These two murders happened within 3 months of each other. Then for over a year, Peg-Leg was not heard from again. His next appearance was in London, where on Hampstead Heath he stabbed Professor Thomas Belding, the noted authority on Eastern religions. Now I come to the last of Peg-Leg's activities. His final murder occurred here in Camberwell and robbed me of one of my dearest friends. The Reverend Frank Parkington was a bachelor, and with young Harry Fellows, his curate, lived in the old stone vicarage just behind the Church of St. Anne's. He was in all particulars the finest man I have ever known, a brilliant preacher, a good friend, an ardent worker in his chosen field. His home was a rendezvous for a few of us who, over a convivial pipe, liked to discuss those matters of the day that interested us. On the night of his death, we had gathered at his request to meet Captain Charles Wonderly, the Indian explorer who was his guest. We found this fellow Wonderly a very interesting talker. He had travelled far and seen much, and knew how to picture in words what he had seen. With his descriptions and anecdotes, he held us interested until well toward midnight. I remember that I arrived home at about 12:15. I retired immediately. But I did not go to sleep at once, as my mind was still full of Captain Wonderly's stories. Just as I was dozing off, I heard the church clock strike 2, and at the same instant there came a violent ringing at my doorbell. I found Harry Fellows awaiting me on my doorstep. "Come quickly," he said in a voice hoarse from excitement. "Dr. Parkington is dead, murdered." "Murdered? Good heavens, man, are you mad?" I shouted, staring into his face that showed pale and haggard in the feeble light of my hall lamp. For answer, he reached out and shook me roughly by the shoulder. "Will you come?" he said fiercely, "or shall I have to carry you?" Had I not immediately shown signs of obeying his demand, I really believe the young giant would have picked me up and carried me just as I was in pajamas and slippers. His love for Parkington, who had been more than a father to him, was a strong thing, and at that moment his grief made him less than reasonable. In less than 10 minutes, we were on the road to the vicarage. As we hurried through the still night, Fellows briefly told me what had happened. Chapter 2. After his guests had left, Parkington and Captain Wonderly, who was staying for the night, went to their rooms. Because he had some work to finish, Fellows had remained downstairs. At about 1:15 he was just finishing his writing when he was startled and frightened by the sound of a blood-curdling moan followed by the sound of someone choking. As soon as he had pulled himself together, he ran upstairs, and instinct guided him to Parkington's room. He knocked at the door, and when there was no answer, he pushed it open and entered the bedroom. There, on his knees beside the bed, he found Parkington dead. A knife or some long, sharp instrument had been driven into his back. "What did you do then?" I asked. "Called Rogers, the servant, and sent him off for the police." "You didn't rouse Wonderly?" "No. In the excitement, I forgot all about the fellow." We entered the vicarage and raced up the stairs to Parkington's room. There we found Chief Constable Smithers in charge, and with him a quiet-looking man, whom he introduced as Inspector Grant of Scotland Yard. "Down for a bit of a holiday, sir," and stopping with me. But for the moment, I paid little attention to Smithers and his friend. I was too greatly upset by the sight of the body lying beside the bed. My natural sorrow at Parkington's death was compounded by the awfulness of the way in which he had been taken from us. I went over and stood beside his body, looking down on it, and swearing that I would find his murderer and see that he paid for his crime. Then I turned to Smithers for his report. "Squire," he began gravely, "what I have to tell you will probably surprise you. You have heard of the notorious Pegleg. Well, sir, there is every indication that this is another of his fiendish crimes." Both Fellows and I stared in amazement. Smithers continued, "Yes, sir, I know that it sounds impossible, but nevertheless, it seems to be a fact. Inspector Grant here, who worked on both the Bascom case and that of Professor Belding, will bear me out when I say that all the clues we have been able to find point in that direction." Inspector Grant nodded his head. Smithers crossed the room and stood midway between the bed and an open window that looked out on poor Parkington's lawn. He pointed downward at the carpet. "See here, sir. Those little round marks, and here, leading right to the window, sir. And plenty more of them on the ground below, accompanied by the print of one shoe which does not show on this carpet." "And those marks," I began. "They're from a wooden leg," Smithers finished. "But see here," Fellows cried from beside the window. "How did the beggar get in the house? No man with a wooden leg could climb up here." Smithers shook his head. "No good, sir. It's really a very easy job. You have the hooks that hold the drain pipe all the way. Both Grant and I tried it and had no trouble at all." "Have you tried to follow the trail?" I asked. "Lord bless you, yes, sir. We did that at once. But it leads nowhere. The prints are lost on the stone road less than 100 feet down the highway." We were all bending over those horrible indentations in the carpet when a sound at our backs caused us to look up. In the doorway, Clad in his pajamas was Captain Wonderly, rubbing his eyes and yawning. "I say, you chaps," he said, "what's up?" Then he caught sight of Parkington's body and started forward. "Good heavens, Parkington!" he exclaimed. "What's wrong with him? Is he hurt?" "Dead," I answered briefly. In a dazed sort of way, Wonderly turned his eyes from one to another of us. At last they rested on Smithers, and guided by the constable's uniform, addressed him as the officer of the law. "Have you got the man that did this?" "Not yet," Smithers replied. "And now, sir, I'll trouble you to tell me who you are and what you know of this business." Wonderly indicated Fellows and me. "These gentlemen know me," he said. "My name's Wonderly. I was a friend of Dr. Parkington. As for what I know of this business, unfortunately, I can't help you a bit. You were staying in the house." Wonderly looked down significantly at his nightclothes. "I certainly was," he answered, "in that room across the hall. And you heard nothing? No sound?" An expression of sorrow, almost of shame, passed over Wonderly's face. "If I only had," he replied quietly. "I'll wager Parkington would be alive now. You see, gentlemen, some years ago I lost the hearing in my right ear. This deficiency doesn't bother me ordinarily, but if I happen to go to sleep on my left ear, as I did tonight, I'm as deaf as a post." At my suggestion, we went downstairs and seated ourselves in the library, leaving the murder chamber and its ghastly inhabitant untouched to await the coroner's arrival. But hardly had we taken our chairs when Fellows jumped to his feet, exclaiming, "This sitting around while Dr. Parkington's murderer is making good his escape is too much for me. I'm going to have a look around." I put out my hand to stop him, but at a signal from Smithers, "Let it fall." "Let him go," he said after Fellows had left the room. "It won't do any good, but it won't do any harm, and it may ease the poor lad to be doing something." "Of course you have sent out a general alarm?" I asked Smithers a minute later. He nodded. "Of course, sir. Any one-legged man seen hereabouts will find his way to the police station." Then we began a careful consideration of the crime, each man suggesting what he thought might help toward clearing it up and bringing the criminal to justice. In this consultation, I conceived a great admiration for Captain Wonderly. The man had an exceedingly keen mind. In competition with Smithers and Inspector Grant, both old hands in the pursuit of criminals, he showed up wonderfully. No point escaped him, and several times he set the others right in the development of a theory or in the statement of facts. There and then, I said to myself that if I could persuade Wonderly to give up his time to seeking the murderer of my friend, I might hope for some results. I was about to put the suggestion to him when we were all startled by the sound of quick footsteps on the stairs and along the hall. An instant later, the library door swung wide and the huge bulk of Fellows filled the aperture. I caught my breath in amazement as I saw the expression on his face. His eyes were wild with excitement, and about his lips were lines of grim determination. Without a word to the detectives or me, he crossed the room to Wonderly and, bending over him, whispered in his right ear. A look of utter amazement came into Wonderly's eyes. This was quickly followed by fear, which in turn changed to a sort of blind rage. He strove to rise, but Fellows's hand was around his throat and held him tightly to his chair. Then very slowly, Fellows brought his other hand from behind his back. In it was a long knife and some queer contrivance whose purpose I could not make out. He threw these things on the table in front of Wonderly. "Smithers," he said in a cold, hard voice, "I want you to arrest this man for the murder of John Elder, Sir Roger Bascom, Professor Belding and Dr. Parkington." Chapter 3. What happened then occurred so quickly that we others had no time to pull ourselves together and go to Fellows's aid. There was a brief struggle between Fellows and Wonderly, a cry from the latter, the tinkle of broken glass on the floor, and then suddenly Wonderly's body went limp in Fellows's hands. "Poison," Fellows muttered, bending over the body of his late antagonist. The beggar had it in the pocket of his dressing gown. He picked up a rug from the floor and threw it over the body in front of him. Now we all crowded around Fellows and burst into a babble of questions. He raised one hand to silence us, and with the other pointed at the queer contrivance which, along with a knife, lay in front of Wonderly's corpse. "There," he said, "is the wooden leg of your peg leg." The thing was a piece of board cut in the shape of the sole of a shoe. From the bottom projected a short, round stick tipped with an iron ferrule. At the front and back were straps by which it might be fastened to a man's foot. Only a brief examination of it was needed to see how, once so fastened, the prints the wearer would leave behind would certainly resemble those of a one-legged man. Smithers was the first to break the silence. "Mr. Fellows," he said, "I must congratulate you. You have laid by the heels a man whom the best detectives in England couldn't catch. But I beg of you, sir, tell us how you did it." Fellows sank into a chair. "All right," he said, "it must be some time, and I suppose it might as well be now." He drew a square leather-bound book from his pocket. "But first," he went on, "I want you to listen to a few extracts from Wonderly's diary. They will throw some light on the man's motives for his dastardly crimes." Then, in a low voice, he read us the following. "Calcutta, November 16, civilization again. After 5 years of freedom to be cooped up in this place of narrow streets and silly houses. But if it is my destiny to carry on the war among men of my own race, I must not begin by complaining. I see none but strange faces on the streets and in the clubs. Thanks to the gods, the men who knew me have gone their ways. The fools, they despised me because my eyes sought the light, and when, having found it, I followed it, they said that I had gone fantee. How I could laugh at them now, the pretentious asses with their weak, anemic gods, thinking they know the secrets of life. I who have stood before the altar of Siva and watched the spilling of the blood, I who have hearkened to the angry voice of Kali, would bid them halt and reconsider their conceit, lest the vengeance that is Asia's descend upon them. London, the message came today, and it is to kill, kill, kill. My birthday, and I have begun the great work. John Elder is dead. Even now the police are searching for the one-legged man who killed him. One-legged. I wonder if the fools will ever see through my little scheme for sending them hunting the wild goose. The good work continues. Bascombe and Belding are gone the way of Elder. So may all men go who lift their hands against the holy gods. Fellows closed the book and threw it aside. A madman, I whispered. A religious fanatic of the worst type, Fellows answered. I think I can piece his story together. He became enamored with native life and probably fell into the hands of the priests. Or perhaps a woman led him to the native shrines, and their damnable religion got into his blood and drove him mad. Smithers scratched his head. But what made him kill? Because his victims were the enemies of his religion. All 4 of them knew the evil practices of his cult, knew how his priests were holding back the people of India. With their best efforts and their money, here in England, they were fighting the battles of their dark-skinned brothers thousands of miles away. Now will you tell us how you found this fellow out? The question came from Inspector Grant. Fellows nodded and began. There was one thing that bothered me from the time Wonderly entered the room upstairs, and that was his explanation for not hearing Parkington's cry and the ensuing commotion which I and the rest of us must have made. You remember, he said that he was totally deaf in the right ear. That would have been all right had I not happened to remember that I sat on his right side at dinner tonight and once spoke to him in a voice barely above a whisper in his right ear. And he heard perfectly. My first idea was that the man was a coward and had stayed in his room because he had been afraid to come out and see what all the noise was about. I held to that opinion until we had come downstairs and I left you to wander about the garden. When I went outside, my first impulse was to take a lantern and examine the famous footprints. I did so and traced them as you did down to the stone road. Then I came back to the house and began to wander aimlessly about the other side of it. I ended up a few yards away from Wonderly's window. Happening to glance downward, I saw something that sent the blood racing through my veins. There on the ground before me, in a soft spot on the gravel, were another set of footprints, and these were of a man with 2 legs wearing shoes that seemed to correspond to the single shoe worn by the man with 1 leg. I raced around to the other side of the house and verified my suspicion. Then I went back to my find. I took the direction the prints pointed out and followed it slowly, my lantern close to the ground. A ways farther on, I found another set of prints and so on. Every little while I found them until I had made a wide detour and was out on the stone road where the murderer's prints began and ended. At first I did not realize the significance of what I had discovered. Then it suddenly came to me that a man could easily leave the footprints of a 1-legged man if, in walking, he used a stilt or some such device. Also, I recalled that the new prints had begun at Wonderly's window. Then I knew why he hadn't joined us in Parkington's room sooner. It was because he was probably in hiding somewhere at the other side of the house, waiting for a chance to slip back into his room after having murdered my friend and left those bewildering prints. I came back to the house, crept upstairs, and went through his things. You know what I found and what happened after that. End of The Mystery of the 1-Legged Man by J.B. Hawley. The Weeping Killer by Harry M. Sutherland. The Black Mask, December 1921. For Moriarty, it had been almost as hard to walk from the condemned cell to freedom by way of the main entrance as it would have been to take that other walk through the little door that leads to the electric chair. He had suffered all that a man can suffer who faces a horrid death. The last of a once iron nerve had been put into the task of dressing himself in his execution garments, and when the order for a new trial had been read to him, the once powerful gang leader had silently crumpled in a heap on the floor. He was all in, through, done for as surely as the electric chair could have finished him. Never again would he be able to hold a gun in his hand to take his place as the undisputed king of his world. They would not let him. He might try it, but he knew they would find him out. No man could hold his position, he told himself time after time, who had been through what he had endured. Try as he did to hide it, he knew that his old slaves and subjects had seen him tremble during the ridiculously easy second trial of his case. Even the assurances of his lawyers that it was all fixed, that his acquittal was a sure thing, could not sustain him. He could not keep his hands from shaking, and the muscles of his face from working. The brazen effrontery of his stare, the menace of his squared shoulders, was gone. He had stammered as he told his prepared lie on the witness stand, and he knew that his old henchmen were shaking their heads behind his back as they accompanied him in a sort of damp jubilation from the courtroom and back to the old rendezvous. What a farce it had been when, after the first rounds of drinks had been drunk to his return, Jeff Hardy had in formal argot surrendered his place as regent and formally handed him his old pistol as a token of renewed leadership of the gang. Leader. Why, he knew and they knew and he knew they knew he knew that he was not fit to be even an apprentice in that company of blood and steel. Every night for a week after that, he could see in the darkness above his bed the sneer in the smile on Hardy's face, as he surrendered the leadership which he had already found so sweet. Surrendered it. No wonder Jeff had sneered at the very idea. Moriarty had been a real leader of men, guided into the realms of some great manufacturing enterprise, politics or finance. He would have been as great as he had become in the world of violence and crime. Instead of the master of the men who work in steel or coal or gold, fate had decreed that he should become the master of men who deal in crime. And just as disaster overtakes great leaders in great industry, so had disaster overtaken him on the night when Sailor Bradley had dared dispute his preeminence and met the death the code demanded. No one in the underworld doubted who had killed Bradley. Moriarty was alive the next morning, and Bradley was dead. That was evidence enough. But there was considerable surprise when the leader of the woodchucks was sentenced to death for murder. Every resource was assembled to prevent his execution and obtain his freedom, and these weapons had triumphed. They had brought back their leader, but found they had only a weakling in his stead. Why, there had been tears in his eyes when the verdict of his acquittal was read in court. Twice he had been seen faltering in his step as he came from the loft building in which the woodchucks had their clubroom. He started at the slightest sound of anything like a pistol shot. And worst of all, he refused to carry a gun. That was the situation during the 2 weeks following the old leader's return. Then, on a Sunday morning, Terence Moriarty, bright-eyed, square of shoulder, spring in his step, and a smile on his face, had gleefully pummeled 2 new members of the gang who accidentally blocked his path, hurled a bottle through a clubroom window, and undisputedly resumed his sway. The night before, as all of the world that mattered to him well knew, Jeff Hardy had screamed Moriarty's name as he died, and the old leader had automatically been crowned anew. It did not matter so much to the woodchucks how Hardy had died. That was a matter for the police to find out. The police did, to their own satisfaction at least, but Moriarty merely smiled at the sensation their theories caused. He still refused to carry a gun, but he still led the woodchucks, more feared and respected than he ever was, and with confidence that his path of glory need not lead a man of intelligence again to the death house. Jeff Hardy's body had been found at the bottom of the elevator shaft in the old loft building, in which his gang occupied a portion of an upper floor. Without doubt, he had fallen or been hurled 6 stories to the concrete pit below. That he had not committed suicide was certain. There was no reason why he should in the first place, and in the second place, 2 reliable witnesses swore they had heard him cry, "Damn you, Moriarty," as he fell. Moriarty had been arrested, of course, but released almost at once, because policemen as well as eminently respectable citizens had seen him a block away from the building at the same time that Hardy's scream was heard by the night watchman and elevator man of the building. It had taken some time to drag Hardy's body from the pit and identify it. This caused a delay, but even at that, the police admitted they probably would have been unable to make out a case against the old leader, no matter how rapidly they worked. Captain Bush, who knows probably as much about gangsters and gang politics as any police officer in the city, had ordered the arrest of Moriarty as soon as he heard of Hardy's death. He did that even before he knew that the old leader was the last man seen with the new chieftain. He was also the one who recommended the discharge of the prisoner the next morning. "There are more ways than one of killing a cat," Captain Bush remarked philosophically to some of his newspaper friends, "and the law doesn't keep up with all of them." "But you admit Hardy was alone when he fell down the elevator shaft," persisted one of his questioners. "Why do you think he was killed?" "He was killed as surely as Terence is again king of the woodchucks," replied the police veteran. "He was killed because Moriarty had lost his nerve. He was killed in the way he was because of the long nights Moriarty had spent in the death house, by a man who knew that if Hardy was killed by a shot, he would walk through the little door instead of the big one on his second trip from his cell. He was killed by a man with brains and that imagination which had made him a tamed slayer. I know what happened as surely as I know I am sitting here, but there would be no use in going into court with it." Hardy had openly challenged the old leader's authority. Everybody knows that. Even the boys on the street were mocking Moriarty. He had wept in court. He had been seen twice walking unsteadily out of the building, wiping his eyes with his handkerchief and seeming to be half blinded by tears. Once the elevator man had to help him to the street. Everybody in the district knew about it. He was in pitiful terror at the thought of the time when Hardy would pull a gun on him and challenge him to fight it out. He knew that when that time came, he would either have to go back to the death house, be killed by Hardy, or disappear. There wasn't much choice. One was as bad as another for him. So, like the man of brains he is, he discarded all three of the obvious alternatives and found a fourth way out of the meeting he knew would have to come. It came last Saturday night. The two of them were alone in the clubroom. Not a man in the gang would have dared to stick his nose inside the door. They knew there would be no question about who their leader was before morning, and there wasn't one of them within a mile of the place. The elevator man and the night watchman both heard them quarreling. They didn't hear the words, but we don't need them. Hardy taunted Moriarty to try to make him pull a gun. He had two, one his own, and another for Moriarty in case he had none of his own. This second gun was loaded with blanks. There were 2 flasks in the room. One had gin in it and was still half full. The other was broken on the floor when Moriarty dropped it as Hardy pulled his gun and called upon him to fight. After dropping the flask, Moriarty walked out of the room and down the stairs, wiping the tears from his eyes as he had been seen doing twice before. The watchman saw him. The elevator man was on the top floor with his car. Moriarty had sent him there to put a new bolt on the roof scuttle. He swears the door at the club floor was closed when he went up, but elevator men always say that. Anyway, the light was burning in the hall. That's all he knows until he heard Hardy scream. But how then did Moriarty kill him? A reporter asked as the captain relighted his cigar. Ever hear of this new tear gas? The policeman questioned. That's what was in the other flask. But wouldn't it blind Moriarty too? It did. But he had experimented until he could find his way out of the building in spite of it. The effect wears off in a few minutes, and by the time he had reached the corner, he was merely crying a few tears and had his alibi all made to order. Meanwhile, Hardy was blundering about until he found the elevator door and fell to his death. An act of providence, I suppose the law might call it, but it was really the act of a damned clever devil. End of The Weeping Killer by Harry M. Sutherland. Fear by Pettersen Marzoni. The Black Mask, December 1921. Chapter 1. Hartley Brentwood of Barnes, Brentwood and Company, was found in his apartment at 6 o'clock in the morning with a bullet wound in his head and a half-smoked cigarette in his fingers. Yes, I killed him, John Barnes, senior member of the firm, told Inspector Thorne of the police department 3 hours later when that officer found him at his country place. I am ready to go with you. The tragedy had shocked the world of finance and society. Barnes and Brentwood were the only members of the firm of Barnes, Brentwood and Company, bankers, which controlled the destinies of half the country's industries. For 15 years, they had been business associates and leaders in finance. Barnes had made no attempt to avoid arrest, none even to hide his crime. An elevator boy had seen him leave Brentwood's apartment late the night before. The shot apparently had not been heard because Brentwood's body had not been discovered until that morning by his valet. Why did you do it? Thorne asked the banker the usual question, but he did it with unusual interest. He had been searching for a motive on his way out, but he could vision none. They were on the train then, returning to New York. Barnes offered to use one of his cars for the short ride, but Thorne was afraid to take a chance despite his apparent submission. Before Barnes answered, he looked toward the gleam of metal under his sleeves, where the handcuffs showed. Would you mind holding a cigar for me, Inspector? Thorne looked at him a moment, then leaned over and unlocked the cuffs. It's a long story, Barnes began, with a sigh of relief as he drew deeply on his cigar. Chapter 2. 15 years ago, my firm was Landis and Barnes. We were bankers and brokers of the old school. At least Landis was. Conservative. More conservative than there was any need for. We had a safe business, but there was nothing in it. When I'd started in as a clerk for old man Landis, my one ambition had been to get into the firm. He was a leader then, and he looked like he had a grip on the world. But when I did arrive, I saw it was only a beginning. Landis wasn't really old physically, but his ideas were old. Younger men all around him had passed him in the race for money. He really didn't care an awful lot about making money. I liked him, but I had to get ahead. It was just born in me. However, he controlled the business and pooh-poohed every real idea I brought to him. We went right on making money his way, but it wasn't my way. I knew it was time to cut loose for big things, and I started planning on them. I couldn't leave Landis because I needed his help for a while. Just about that time, Brentwood came to work for me. I had insisted on a private secretary. Landis never could see the need of one. I even had trouble persuading him to hire enough stenographers. He wasn't tight, he just couldn't see the need for them. But I insisted on the secretary idea. I needed one. It wasn't a question of style, so Brentwood came in with me from the main office. You know what he looked like recently. Then he was only about 25, and he was handsome. He had played football at college, fence too, I believe. He showed the results of both in his size and manner. He was one of those men who looked like statues or models for clothes advertisements. I believe that was one reason I took him. I didn't go to college myself, didn't have time, had to make money. Brentwood was always well dressed. He wasn't making much, but I believe he had a small income from some money an aunt had left him. Besides that, I hadn't heard then of any vices he had. Of course, he took a drink now and then and he smoked, but no one ever called him a spendthrift. He had a social position, I didn't, and he went places then I couldn't get into. I never wanted to. Don't get the idea I was jealous about that. I got everything in the world I wanted, even if I did have to pay for them. I wanted money because money was power, and power was my dream. I have both. At least I had them until last night. Whatever had made me bring Brentwood into my office as private secretary, he justified my choice before he had been with me a week. He started right in taking minor details off my hands. I had more time for getting some of my big plans straightened out. But the size of my plans didn't help me any. Landis was a fool. If we made 6%, he was satisfied. If we made 8%, he thought we were beginning to speculate. And if we made 10%, which happened as often as he let me have my way, he thought it was illegal. I wonder what the old man would say if he had lived until now. I wasn't going to be tied down to a rock like that, and by the time Brentwood had been with me a year, I had too much time on my hands to stand it any longer. Then I hit on the scheme. I would have preferred to do it with Landis. He had been good to me, but what I had in mind I couldn't even talk to him about. He would have fixed it, so I couldn't get in with anyone else. I needed his money and other things he had. They made the thing possible, so I went after someone else. Even though Landis wouldn't listen, other firms had been getting a line on me. Whenever the firm put over anything big, they all knew I did it. You remember old Tom King, crooked as a snake, but he knew how to make money. I had met him at lunch once or twice, but he had kept track of me, I knew, from things he said. He never ate anything but crackers and milk. He saw me order the same one day, so he took more interest in me. I thought he would. When I decided it was time to put over my scheme, I picked out King for the second man. It took 2 of us. I knew he would be the best I could find, and he would be willing to do it too. But I had to tie him up some way. I had made up my mind that I would double-cross Landis if I had to, but I was going to protect myself. I went to King's house one night and told him my plan. Not all of it, just enough for him to see that it would work if properly handled. He wanted to know everything, but I wouldn't tell him unless he consented to sign an agreement to put the thing through. That agreement was a risky thing, because what we were going to do would put us both in jail if we were found out. He objected to putting his name to anything, but I convinced him of the big possibilities, and he said he would sign. You couldn't take a single chance with King, so I went to my office that night to get the agreement ready. I knew how to use the typewriter, so I wrote it out. I made a carbon copy for myself. It was not 8 o'clock the next morning when I reached my office. I was so anxious to get the deal started and through with that I hadn't slept at all, and I wanted to be down where things were going to happen. I was surprised to hear the typewriter clicking when I let myself in, and there was Brentwood. I wondered what had brought him down so early, and he offered a pile of letters as a reason, so I felt satisfied. By 9 o'clock, King had signed the agreement, and when the market opened, we started to work. You remember when C&Q broke about 50 points? King and I made a fortune, but it broke Landis. He lost his head when he saw the market slipping because most of his money had been tied up in C&Q. He tried to hold it up, but we had our plans worked out too well. We sold short, and I delivered Landis's stock until we could cover. We did all right. Landis lost his nerve with his money and shot himself. I was sorry because I had liked him and he had a wife and a boy, but he had no business in the game anyway. I was glad he hadn't connected me with the break. No one else did either. About 6 months after Landis was dead, I took over the business as Barnes and Company. I saved a little money out of the wreck for Mrs. Landis, and she was comfortable. She was a fine woman, and my little girl Lucia played and went to dancing school with her boy. Everything started out fine for me. Landis's conservative reputation helped me out then on account of the time we had been together, and I had plenty of money to back up anything I started. I had every chance in the world. Then this hound Brentwood began. I had put him in charge of one of the departments in the new firm, and he was making good. He had been there about 3 months when he came up to my house one night. He had been there before, at formal dinners once or twice, when my wife had thought it necessary to entertain. But there had never been any friendship between us. This night, he asked for me and came into the library. I was feeling pretty good. I had put over a fair-sized deal that day, and dinner had been comfortable. We didn't have any guests. I was surprised at the visit, but I didn't let on. I offered him a drink and a cigar. He refused the cigar and lighted one of his own cigarettes. He always had them made for him, he told me. He didn't waste any remarks about the weather or my health. "When are you thinking of increasing the firm, Mr. Barnes?" he began. That surprised me. Nothing I had ever said to him had indicated any intention of taking in any partners. I didn't need any. All I needed was money and room. I had had 2 partners and I didn't want any more. Landis was dead, and King too had died about a month before. Apoplexy, I believe. At first I started to bawl him out, but I thought better of it. Maybe he was trying to lead up to some idea with a joke. I had been with Landis too long and saw how much a man could lose by not listening to ideas. "Do you want to buy in?" I asked him. If he did have any scheme, I was ready to listen to it in the hope it was worthwhile. He seemed to be surprised. He knew I had a temper. He'd been in my office for a year. I guess he was all set for a fight right away. But he smiled and went on. "Not buy exactly, but I think it can be arranged to suit us both." "Like hell you do," I yelled. I was more than surprised. I thought he must have gone crazy, but I didn't like his smile. He didn't say anything, just sat there and smiled at me. He didn't look like a crazy man, and I began to wonder. All the time he had been with me, he had been perfectly sane and he had never tried to joke. He was efficient and always on the job. What had happened to make him start out like he had was a mystery to me. "What do you mean? Have you been drinking or dreaming?" I tried to keep myself in hand, because at the back of my brain something had started to stir. Men with brains don't usually have crazy schemes, and I knew he hadn't been drinking, and he wasn't the sort to dream without something to base it on. I began to think of reasons for him getting up the nerve to say what he did. It took nerve. And something else. I had never let him in on anything, and outside of the deal with King, there hadn't been anything that could really cause trouble. And that King deal was safe. I had written the only papers in the thing myself. After the deal was over, King and I had taken care to burn them. But he had to have some reason, and I was losing my temper again. All the while he just sat. "Listen, Brentwood," I told him then, "I don't know what you are talking about. But the only satisfactory arrangement you can reach with me is to be ready to find another job by the 1st of the month. You are leaving us then." "I'm afraid you are wrong, Mr. Barnes." And he reached into his pocket. He brought out a leather case, and from it he took something and unfolded it very carefully. I couldn't make out what it was at first. It was black, about the size of a letter sheet. Then I saw it was a piece of carbon paper. Even then, I didn't get on right away. "Did you ever see this before?" he asked, holding it up for me to see. The marks of the typewriter stood out. I couldn't read them, but I knew what it was. I remembered the morning of my deal with King and Brentwood being down at the office early. When I wrote the agreement with King, I forgot all about the carbon paper. I really didn't realize until then that the carbon would carry any record. I must have just dumped it into the wastebasket when I finished. Brentwood was watching me, and he must have known what I was thinking. "What is it anyway?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but I was beginning to get nervous. I'd been learning things about Brentwood ever since he began the conversation. "Do you want me to read it to you, Mr. Barnes?" As he asked the question, he smiled again. I had stood all of that smile I was going to. It must have made me lose my head. I couldn't take a chance on that thing coming out with Landis not yet dead a year. I had to have that piece of carbon. He sidestepped me as I rushed and grabbed me from behind. "I told you," he had played football. "There is no need for excitement, Barnes." He dropped the mister then. "You can't get this away from me without killing me. You had better listen to reason." I saw I couldn't manhandle him. I had never been a strong man, and his grip on my wrists was like iron. "Well, say what you've got to say." I managed to control my temper long enough to get it out. "Suppose we outline a few possibilities first," he began. "There isn't a chance of convicting you of anything by this piece of carbon paper by itself. The district attorney couldn't use it as evidence without something to back it up. But what happened to C and Q about 9 months ago, everyone knows. This little piece of paper tells what was going to happen before it ever did. It also mentions the matter of Landis's stock. Old King may be dead, but he still has a grip on you. I don't want to take this to the district attorney. I wouldn't have to, as far as that goes. Public opinion would be enough if I made this public. It would be an unpleasant scandal, and it might be hard for me to get located profitably after having been so intimately connected with you. Besides, there isn't anything 1/10 so good as what you can give me. For a 20% interest in the firm, I will tuck this little piece of paper away in a safe deposit vault, and the world will move merrily on." He had turned me loose, and we were sitting facing each other. I believe then was the first time I had ever had a good look at his eyes. They were close together, and there was a kind of murky green fire playing around way down deep. His whole face was different. There wasn't anything to it. I argued with him about how the district attorney would laugh at his romantic idea of using a piece of carbon paper, but he had me scared and he knew it. Then I agreed to his plan with the amendment that he burn the paper. He laughed then, and it was a long way from a chuckle. He must be laughing like that now, knowing what is going to happen to me. "Burn it, and let you get me like you did Landis?" he wanted to know. "I know you, Barnes, and there is nothing you wouldn't do to make money. My proposition is made and it goes. You can take it or leave it." I took another look at that face, and I agreed. He smiled then and drew out a little pile of papers from his pocket. One was an article of agreement for the partnership, providing for the change of the firm name. The others were notices for the papers of the change. I signed them all, and then I wondered how he had happened to look for the carbon. I hated to ask him, but I had to know. "You have a bad habit of leaving things around," he told me when I did ask. "Besides that, I have been with you long enough to see your crooked brain work. I saw you make a play at Old King one day at lunch. You remember, the day you had crackers and milk. I knew you usually had roast beef and all the vegetables you could find on the menu, finishing up with pie. I saw you meet him other times, and I knew that you were discussing trouble for someone. You may not remember, but I helped you check over the securities in the Landis safe deposit box one day. Then I began to watch you. I knew something was coming, and that you would make a fortune. I wasn't going to be left out. The night before you went up to King's house, you did a little figuring on your scheme. You burned some of the papers. I found the ashes, but you must have crumpled up one of them without thinking about it. I don't mind telling you I found it in your wastebasket. I discovered that a search of that basket every night was usually worthwhile. I heard you call Mrs. Barnes and tell her you were not coming home for dinner, and I followed you until I saw you safely in King's house. When I came down the next morning, I met the night watchman leaving, and he remarked that you must be trying to check me up because you had been down to the office the night before using the typewriter. You see, I had a pretty clear trail. The cigar I smoked that night was the last comfortable one I have had until this. There hasn't been a moment, until last night, that I haven't thought about that piece of carbon paper. And don't think Brent would let me forget about it either. He didn't mention it for a year. Then he came in and remarked that he thought he was growing more valuable as a member of the firm. I wasn't quite cowed then, and I let myself go for a minute, but he brought me up sharp. Oh, he had me all right. I agreed. The next time came about 2 years later. He asked me up to his apartment for dinner that night. I went, and he asked for another 5%. There wasn't any argument at all. Don't think that Brentwood wasn't making good. He had a genius for finance. He never had a scheme that failed. Of course, we didn't make millions out of everything he brought up, but we never lost, and he worked hard. My dinner engagements with him came about every 2 years, which brought us up to 6 months ago. I never had anything to do with him outside of the office except at dinners at my house. Formal dinners, when he was just one of the guests. Each time I went to his place, he had a 5% larger interest in the firm. The last time left him with a full half. I had begun to take it for granted. I knew that every 2 years I would have to eat all alone with him and listen to his rotten talk about women. He was a cad, and he knew I hated his stories. That's the reason he told them. Then after dinner, he would make his same smiling demand, and there was nothing for me to do. Did I tell you that I hadn't had a peaceful moment since he showed me that paper? I couldn't tell my wife about it. She is a wonderful woman. She doesn't even suspect that I was mixed up in the Landis affair. You are the first human being I have been able to tell this thing to after 15 years of living it. 15 years is a long time. I don't want your sympathy. It's all over now, and I want to get it off my mind. But that doesn't make any difference about my shooting Brentwood. As I said, he called on me last about 6 months ago. I thought then that I would have 2 more years of almost peace when something else came up. You may have seen a picture of my daughter Lucia. It was published last winter when she made her debut. She is her mother all over again, and I am just daddy to her. She has always been my pal since she was a little girl. And she is now too. Anyway, she made her debut last winter, and Brentwood started coming to the house more frequently. I would come home in the afternoon and find him at tea. My wife asked him to dinner 2 or 3 times, just with the family. She had never seen him ask for a larger share of the firm. It kept up, so that I began to have a big fear, bigger than my fear of Brentwood and his carbon paper. Suppose my girl should fall in love with him. A couple of nights ago, by some chance, she was staying at home. She came into the library where I was trying to read, and I decided to try to find out how much she liked Brentwood. She came over and sat on the arm of my chair and pulled my hair. "Where is Brentwood tonight?" I started to question her. Pining away in some dark den, probably. I refused to let him come up. I told him it was Daddy's night. I patted her hand, but still that didn't mean anything. "It seems to me he is coming around pretty frequently these days. You are not the only one who thinks so." And she blushed. Fathers may be stupid, but I knew my daughter, and there was a great load gone off my mind. "Who is he?" I tried to be very stern. Then she slipped down into my lap and told me it was young Landis. The boy had more push than his father and was a comer. I liked him. They had decided that he was to come to see me the next day, and she had stayed at home to tell me about it. Her mother had already given her approval. Young Landis came to see me yesterday. I liked the way he talked, and I told him I was glad that Lucia had chosen him. When he left, I felt so good I told Brentwood about it. I had to tell someone because it meant so much to have my girl happy. He said that Landis was to be congratulated and left it at that. His manner meant nothing to me, and I had about decided to give myself a half holiday when he came into my office and invited me to dinner that night. He saw I was happy and he wasn't going to let me be. He knew I wouldn't refuse to go. I went. Everybody knows that now. He was just the same at dinner as ever, the same boasting of his amours. I managed to live through it because all the time my mind was busy wondering whether I could argue him out of asking for a larger share of the firm. Right at present, I wanted to give Lucia and Landis a start, and I had to get all the returns I could to do it properly. But it wasn't money he was after. "I am not going to keep you in suspense, Barnes," Brentwood began. "The reason I invited you up here immediately was to prevent you making the mistake you did this morning. It will never do for you to announce Lucia's engagement to too many people. They might not understand it later." "Understand what?" I demanded. I didn't need an answer. I knew what he meant, but I had to have him say it. "Because, Barnes, you will have to arrange for her to marry me." I didn't argue. I shot him. Chapter 3. Barnes finished his story as the train was crashing over the switches of the Grand Central. When they reached the station, the banker reached out his wrists for the handcuffs, but Thorne apparently didn't see the movement. As he led the way out, after Thorne had deposited his prisoner at the tombs, his one thought was the piece of carbon paper in Brentwood's safe deposit box. A brief sketch of Barnes's story procured an order for his entry to the box. Buried under a mass of bonds, securities, and letters, Thorne found an unmarked envelope. In it was a piece of carbon paper, carefully folded once. The detective had brought a mirror with him, and he held it before the carbon to read the damning evidence. With staring eyes, he read, "Mr. Blair Townley, Chairman Charity Ball Committee. Dear Sir, on instructions from Mr. Barnes, I am enclosing here with a check for $10 for tickets number 313 and number 314 to the charity ball." End of Fear by Pettersen Marzoni. The Finishing Touch by Charles S. Wolfe. The Black Mask, December 1921. Chapter 1. A hasty survey assured Ridgely that he was alone on the star-lit country road. With a sigh of satisfaction, he plunged swiftly into the brush which skirted the roadside. There he paused, alert, until his straining ears convinced him that his movements had been unobserved. Then he made himself comfortable for his brief vigil, Crouching there, he reviewed minutely his actions so far and his plans for what was to come. There was yet time, if he had erred, if there was a flaw, to withdraw quietly. It was merely a matter of waiting for another night. To be confronted with the damage wrought by an overlooked trifle when it was too late would be agonizing. And his very confidence disquieted him, made him feel that there was something amiss. Yet he could find no weak link in his carefully forged chain. His left hand, dropping into his coat pocket, found the bottle of cyanide of potassium solution securely corked and ready to assume its role. His automatic weighed heavily in the other pocket, well oiled and loaded. The light mask which now covered the upper half of his face was really of no importance, just an extra precaution which discounted the possible, but highly improbable, intrusion of some pedestrian. The cyanide, he felt sure, no one would be able to trace. Several weeks before, he had stolen a couple of small lumps, quite enough for his purpose, from the private laboratory of a friend who rode the hobby of chemistry. Few people knew of the existence of the little attic laboratory, fewer still were aware of his acquaintance with its owner, and the man himself was ignorant of the fact that his supply had been levied on. Since the deadly stuff had been dissolved and bottled, and the bottle scrupulously cleaned, he had taken pains to avoid touching it bare-handed. Right now, his left hand was gloved with rubber. There would be no fingerprints to damn him. Footprints need give him no concern. The roadway was dry and reasonably hard. The discoverers of the corpse would quickly obliterate any slight clues of a definite nature that he might thus leave. The keenest of sleuths could examine the scene of his crime to their heart's content. They would learn nothing. He had made no attempt to establish an alibi, and in this he was satisfied. He had acted wisely. The business of trying to demonstrate that you were where you were not is usually a dangerous undertaking. It involves either the employment of confederates or the use of complicated subterfuges which must either function with precision or turn into veritable boomerangs. The collapsing alibi is too often the royal road to the electric chair. Ridgely knew that there was just one person who could be relied on to be forever silent on this night's work himself. Better to take the chance of the authorities being unable to prove that he was on the spot at the time than to assume the burden of proving that he was not. And anyway, most of the precautions he had taken were no doubt unnecessary. They represented merely his forethought in forestalling unlooked-for disaster before it occurred. The chances were that the case would be looked on as just what it seemed on the surface, suicide. There would probably be little more than a perfunctory inquiry. An inquest at which every fact produced would seem to demonstrate conclusively that the man took his own life. Ridgely prided himself that the idea of killing a man by forcing him to kill himself was a master stroke. A man found dead on the road, dead from the effects of poison, and with the bottle containing that poison clutched tightly in his stiffened hand, is obviously a suicide. There is no reason to suspect foul play unless someone is known to have a strong motive for putting the unfortunate one out of the way. And to the best of Ridgely's knowledge and belief, Morey hadn't an enemy in the world save himself. And, thanks to his consistent and flawless dissimulation, his secret was his own. Outwardly he had been quite friendly with Morey. Not too friendly, just enough so to be counted really indifferent. In the rare event of murder being suspected and a murderer sought for, there would be no reason for alarm. One other only might possibly connect him with the night's events. Morey's wife. Jean Morey and Ridgely shared a rather guilty secret. She could assign to him a motive, but here again he was confident that perfect technique had practically nullified the danger of aroused suspicion. By guarding every word, by well-planned and controlled actions, he had assured her belief that he, like herself, was a harmless flirt. Not once had she been permitted to glimpse the terrible passion that was his. Never had she been allowed to plumb the depths of his crafty and daring nature. He was safe on that score. Under the pretense of carefully guarding her reputation, he had concealed their affair from outsiders, and to her herself, he had made the matter seem trivial. There was one circumstance, however, that might cause comment, and as he thought of it, Ridgely grinned. While it was true that no one apparently had a motive for slaying Maury, it was equally true that the man had no apparent motive for killing himself. Happy, carefree, comfortably wealthy, and well satisfied with life, people might wonder that he should court death. Ridgely grinned, for it was to this, to his mind, the weakest point of his whole coup, that he had devoted the most thought, expended the greatest effort. He had supplied the motive. Here was the artistic triumph of the whole thing. Here was the finishing touch. For the suspicions of the authorities would be allayed before they were aroused. During the 3 months that he had known the Mauries, Ridgely had quietly and unobtrusively collected specimens of John Maury's handwriting. Through diligent practice, he had perfected the art of imitating the man's scrawl so convincingly that he had no fear of the fraud being detected. Not only had he studied the writing itself minutely, but also the style and tricks of speech. Beyond doubt, the missive he had crafted with such care would pass as the dead man's own work. He drew forth an envelope, and by the light of his electric torch, scrutinized with pride and satisfaction the letter he had written. The envelope was addressed to Mrs. John Maury. My dear Jean, I am sorry, terribly sorry, for the notoriety this thing will cause. I realize that you will be shocked. I am asking your forgiveness. For 4 years I have suffered in silence. Our marriage was a bitter mistake. I did not love you. I realized it when it was too late. I've done my best to conceal the fact from you, but I know I could not go on living a lie much longer. I am taking the easiest way out. It is only just that I should suffer for my own sin. John. As he replaced the letter in its envelope, Ridgely chuckled. He would place this missive in the man's pocket after he had fallen, and there would be the motive all ready to satisfy the most critical. Scandal-loving eyes scanning Maury's past for sensational disclosures of his implied double life would not dwell too closely on the method of his demise. He stiffened. The soft thud of moving feet on the hard road reached his ears, growing steadily louder. He knew it was Maury. The moment had come. Chapter 2. Ridgely's hand closed resolutely over his automatic. Maury, he knew, was unarmed. He slipped soundlessly to the very edge of the copse and waited until the approaching form was only a few feet from his ambush. Then he sprang out, weapon leveled, barring the way. There was a startled oath as Maury caught sight of the ominous figure before him. Ridgely's gruff command to throw up his hands was instantly obeyed. The surprise was complete. "Don't speak," Ridgely said, hoping his disguised voice would completely mask his identity, but it didn't matter, really. "Do as you're told. You are going to sleep for an hour or so while I clean you and make my getaway." "Really?" Maury was regaining his nerve. "I haven't enough about me to make it worth your while." "Shut up!" Ridgely's command was curt as he advanced toward his victim, the deadly bottle in his gloved left hand. He extended it toward Maury. "Drink it," he growled, determinedly. Maury lowered one arm and took the bottle hesitatingly. "What is it?" he asked falteringly. "Chloral hydrate, if you must know," responded Ridgely in tones of well-feigned sulkiness. "Enough to put you out for a couple of hours. Knockout drops. Take your choice. Drink it and go out for a couple of hours, or," he waved the automatic suggestively, "go out for keeps." "Look here," began Maury. "I'll promise." "Drink it," Ridgely snapped savagely. Without further parley, Maury raised the bottle to his lips. It was only an instant, really, but to Ridgely, waiting anxiously, it seemed hours before the body crumpled to the roadway. Then swiftly he went to his victim, pocketing his automatic. His gloved hand inserted the letter into Maury's pocket. He noted that the bottle was tightly gripped in the dead man's hand, and noiselessly he stole away from the place. A short cut through a little woodland brought him out onto a main road. Without haste, he wended his way toward the summer hotel. He was jubilant. Maury was out of his way. He had only to wait for the proper moment to increase the ardor of his courting. He felt that the widow would lend an attentive ear. He passed no one on the road. Everything was coming his way. As he gained his room unobserved, he was whistling softly. Not a pang of remorse came to sear his conscience. Ridgely wasn't that kind. He turned in and slept like a top. He was awakened by a sharp knocking on the room door. Bright sunlight was streaming through the thinly curtained windows. A hasty glance at the clock told him that it was after 10. The knocking continued insistently. He sprang out of bed and reached for his bathrobe. "Just a minute," he called as he hurriedly pulled a comb through his tousled hair. An instant later, fairly presentable, he was gazing inquiringly at the tall young man who had pushed in through the partly open door. Even before the other had introduced himself, Ridgely knew that his caller was a detective. Something must have gone wrong, he thought, and his mind raced swiftly over the details of the evening before, seeking to find and forestall the consequences of a slip. He was not panicky. His visitor was speaking. "John Maury was found dead on the road late last night, Mr. Ridgely." Ridgely carefully sidestepped a possible trap. "An accident?" he asked, in perfectly feigned surprise and concern. "No," replied the other. "He was murdered." Ridgely concealed his dismay. How had they reached that conclusion so soon, in the face of his carefully prepared evidence to the contrary? "Murdered," he echoed blankly. "How? By whom?" The tall young man sat down, watching Ridgely narrowly. His right hand had dropped carelessly into his pocket. He leaned forward slightly and spoke swiftly. "By you, Mr. Ridgely," he replied evenly. "No, don't interrupt. You set a very pretty stage, my friend, and you have been careful to a fault. It was your little finishing touch that betrayed you. That, and a woman's vanity. Mrs. Maury is a very beautiful woman with a very plain name. It has been her little failing to hide that fact. Her name is not Jean Ridgely, it's Jane, and Maury never called her anything else in private. When she saw that letter you so cleverly left, she knew Maury had never written it despite the excellent forgery. For he hated the name Jean as much as she disliked Jane. She is a big enough woman to admit her own shortcomings and... Shall I read the warrant? End of The Finishing Touch by Charles S. Wolfe.